Hello, everyone. I'm Mrs. Sherman. Welcome to the Manse. Today I have with me my oldest grandson. He's the one that made me a grandmother, and he's the one that gave me my granny name. And so today we're going to have an interesting conversation because he has such a good mother that she taught him history, which was one of his favorite subjects, and he can talk. We were going on our Regency walk yesterday with him, and we were discussing some of these historical things that he found interesting, and one of them was the Athenian government before Christ. So I'm going to let him introduce it, and then and also you're going to learn about ostracism. Now, you thought you knew what that meant, didn't you? Well, he has an interesting history behind that.
Thank you. So just for everyone's background, so we understand where we are in history, the Athenian democracy got started roughly around 500 BC. So this is a little bit before the time of Nehemiah that we're talking about. So just to give you an understanding of where we are, and it's a couple hundred years before Alexander the Great. So just rough dates to help you get a understanding in history. But the Athens is in Greece, and it started out as a small city-state on a little peninsula of its own. If you look where Athens is, you'll see a rocky, rugged peninsula that they're on, and the land around Athens is called Attica. And it emerged as a Greek city-state. The Athenians said they had been there ever since the birth of the moon, so they were one of the earlier settlers of the region. But they started out with their government ran with aristocrats. And you'd have the aristocrats, they would tell you the law, they would be the judges, it was passed down in the family, and that's how Athens ran for a while. And there were 10 aristocrats known as the archons. And that was their name, and then there was a council of the Areopagus, which we run across in the New Testament, but by that time it had changed a lot. But it originated as the judging, as the council of judges, and they would judge hard cases. But as time went on, there was trouble between the aristocrats and the rest of the people, and also between the rich and the poor in Athens. And there was a difference because you have some rich people that were merchants, right? And but they weren't aristocrats. They had just got their wealth outside of that system. And then you have poor people who aren't aristocrats and aren't rich. And so there's all this strife and turmoil about that. And there was one Athenian leader, and this is before 500 BC, so we're kind of getting into the 600s BC. This is just a little background. His name was Solon, and he's remembered as one of the great lawgivers of ancient Greece. But what he tried to do is balance everybody. So he told the rich and the aristocrats that they were being too arrogant, and he told the poor people they were being too greedy, because the poor people wanted the land divided up amongst them. And the rich people were, carrying on, with their noses in the air. And so he tried to tell everyone to calm down and be more reasonable, basically. But he started developing a few interesting institutions, one of which was a council of 400 to try to balance out the Areopagus and making another power group in the state that wasn't just this council of aristocrats known as the Areopagus. And then also he made a class system based on wealth instead of aristocracy, which is an interesting system. Well, after he made his laws, this tyrant named Pisistratus, maybe I'm not pronouncing his name right, but basically this tyrant took over the state of Athens. It was really interesting, the story of how he did it. So at first, there was all these party strife going on between this faction and that faction, and he said to the assembly of the Athenians that he needed a bodyguard because his political enemies were going to assassinate him. And so once he got this bodyguard, with it he took over Athens. And so, he got kicked out. And then he tried again. He tried several times before he finally was able to take over Athens. But one of those attempts, he got this really tall lady to pretend and dressed her up as the goddess Athene of Athens, and he made her ride in the chariot next to him, and suddenly came in on the city and tried to make it look like the goddess of Athens was on his side. So this is the kind of guy he was. But he managed to take over for a while, and he was somewhat moderate, so he didn't execute a bunch of people. He kept reasonable and stayed in power, but his sons got into trouble and got kicked out. And so when the tyranny fell, we're getting closer to the 500s area. When the tyranny fell, there was more party strife. And it was between aristocrats, because even though Solon had done his reforms, the aristocrats were still basically in power. But one of the aristocrats' names was Cleisthenes, and the other's name was Isagoras. And Cleisthenes was losing out. And so he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get the people on my side. So he went out to everyone and said, we're going to radically change the constitution of Athens to include all you guys out there. So then he introduced basically the first Athenian democracy. And what the Athenian democratic system ended up becoming, because Cleisthenes introduced it, and then there were others who made it a little more democratic. But basically any citizen, any man who was a citizen over 18, could gather together on a hill called the Pnyx, is what it's named. And they could sit together in an assembly and decide the business of the state. So it was, in effect, basically a giant men's business meeting. So what happens is when you do that, it's not, I guess in today's system, we would have included more people than they had, because, they had slaves back then, and women weren't in that assembly. But at the same time, compared to the republic we have in America, it could be argued it might have been a little more democratic, because more people would have known someone who was making decisions, like your husband or brother, might be in the assembly making decisions. And one guy, Themistocles, joked that his 4-year-old son was the most powerful man in Athens, because his son ran his mother. His mother ran Themistocles, and Themistocles ran Athens. Anyway, so even though it wasn't, maybe a system that we would do today, it's still compared to, some place like Persia where you still had one king bossing everyone around. It was a democracy.
Well, it reminds me of FDR, who had or was it Teddy Roosevelt? One of them had a daughter named Alice, who they said ran the place. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, some of those behind-the-scenes spoiled kids. The spoiled kids that kind of get their way. Yeah, anyway, so they set up the democracy of Athens, you've got this assembly of people, and some of the farmers from the outside areas might not have made it in all the time, but according to the numbers I've seen, they had about 6,000 people running the state, meeting for those assemblies. And actually they would, on some days, they would send out slaves with ropes dipped in red paint and try to sweep the streets of all the bums to get them in there so they could get their quorum numbers up. I mean, I don't know if they had about quorum numbers. I don't know if they had a quorum or not. I haven't read that part. But basically they wanted more people in the assembly, so they'd send out people with painted ropes to sweep the streets and bring in everybody. But once they had this assembly, that was the basis of the democracy. Now, what does the assembly talk about? Well, different meetings, which they had about 40 meetings every year. And in these different meetings, what would happen is someone they would be about different subjects, but if you wanted an item to discuss in this meeting, you'd have to run it by the Council of the 500. And this came from Solon's Council of the 400 he had set up. But this council, they randomly selected people to be on it, and you basically prepared the agenda for the assembly meeting. So they had the council of 500, and they had the assembly. And then the person who presided over the assembly, they actually had 10 of them, those were elected by lot. And this is interesting about the Athenians we were talking about the other day. Rather than voting for officials to hold offices, in most cases, they just did everything by a lottery. And the same with the juries, which the juries, they had, hundreds of jurors on jury cases. So it wasn't just 12 like we have today.
A lottery would just mean that it wouldn't matter since everyone was equally as good.
Right.
Would have been suitable.
Yeah, so basically, instead of voting for someone, you just, pull the lot, and whoever is there gets in there. And
if they were all qualified, that would be a good method, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, they actually, for certain public offices, they had a little, I guess, a ceremony or a check to make sure that you were a good person, that you had paid your taxes, that you had gone and done your military service if you had to do that, and that you also had worship Zeus and stuff like that. So they tried to make sure that they were people that would have been didn't have problems according to their society for those offices. But there was one. There were maybe a few more, but there was at least one famous office that they did vote on. And this was the office that most prominent politicians sought. Because you'd say, how in a democracy, when everyone goes to the assembly, when everything's chosen by lot, how would you get a politician like, that would be comparable to, or presidents today that lead the nation? And it was the office of the 10 generals. They would elect these 10 generals. And some of the most famous Athenian statesmen like Themistocles, Cimon, Pericles, and people like them, Alcibiades, they all ran for the office of general. And, they were all rhetoricians, so they studied rhetoric, and they knew how to do public speaking, and they could stand there and, basically convince the assembly to follow their ideas. So you also have party politics that came in there too, because the citizens would, align into parties for, a group for peace and a group for war, and these people like Pericles that were influential, most of the time they could convince the Athenian assembly to do it their way. So, you still have some of those political dynamics that we recognize today, even though the government worked quite differently. I mean, basically, any guy could be in Congress. We think of, in America, we have only, what is it, just a small number of senators and representatives making those decisions versus the majority of people. And then a very interesting feature, and you were going to ask me about this, ostracism.
Yes, ostracism. We think we know. It just means you're giving someone the silent treatment.
Yeah. Well, it's the etymology of the word's fascinating because it comes from the word ostrakon. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it means a pottery shard. So pottery shards were kind of like the old-fashioned scrap paper. And you would take these, and this ostracism was a political device in Athens, kind of like a reverse election. So they'd take these pottery shards and they'd write names on them. And they'd write names of prominent politicians that they wanted to ostracize. And what that would look like is, first of all, they'd vote whether they were going to hold an ostracism, and then they'd pick the people that they were thinking of ostracizing, and then everyone would write the name down on these shards, and they'd count up the votes, and whoever won the ostracism, or whoever was ostracized, had to go on vacation for 10 years.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So basically, if, people in Athens thought one guy was becoming too powerful or too dangerous or too influential, basically if, his party lost, I guess, then, they'd ostracize him, and you would go on vacation for 10 years, your house wouldn't be touched, nothing negative would happen to you. You just had to leave Athens for 10 years and go travel. And then when you got back, you could jump right back into politics. But it was a break from you for 10 years. So, that's an interesting feature of the Athenian democracy. And that's where we get our word ostracism. And that's why it has to do with pottery shards, because that's what they would use to vote with. And they actually excavated in Athens and found one of these famous sites with a lot of pottery shards. And it was one of the historical ones, ostracism, which we read about. And the interesting thing was all the names, and it was Themistocles was the one being ostracized, I believe. All the names with the word Themistocles, it was all in the same hand. So it was the same person who had filled out each one of these pottery shards. And I heard that historians, aren't 100% sure what this means, but one theory is that, your political party, the guy running against Themistocles was Aristides. And so the Aristides political club might have been sitting around with these pottery shards, painting up a bunch, and then on the day for the ostracism, they would stand there and hand it out to all their partisans, a pre-filled shard, so that maybe it's a farmer who doesn't know how to write, maybe it's someone who doesn't know how to write, or maybe it's someone that you can convince to, talk into doing this at the moment and give them a nice pre-filled ballot there to vote on.
That's something like harvesting?
Yeah, but what that was is that if that was what was going on, then maybe that would have been a convenient way to ensure that all your partisans voted your way, and you got sure there were enough there. But there might be other speculations. I don't know. It was just an interesting discovery. Right. So I don't know, how long are your videos usually?
An hour, and you've only talked for 17 minutes.
Well, I can tell you another story about it. I can fill up an hour pretty easily. So if you're not tired of me talking, but when I gave you a thumbnail sketch, and just to make sure it wasn't too confusing, and I threw out a lot of names. Basically, you have Athens under the aristocracy, you have Solon, who tries to balance everything out, you have the tyrant Pisistratus, and then you have Cleisthenes coming in to give Athens democracy. And Cleisthenes and Isagoras were rivals for Athens, and Isagoras wanted an aristocracy, and Cleisthenes wanted the democracy. And this is all happening, this is before 500 BC. So this is, I don't remember the date exactly. I should have looked that up. But for me, I'm not a professional historian or anything, but I just like to read these stories, even if I don't remember the dates exactly. Most people, exact dates don't matter. They just want to know roughly when it happened. So anyway, what happened was Cleisthenes, once he got all the people on his side, they started setting up a democracy, and Isagoras realized that he was losing power. So what Isagoras did is he went to another Greek city-state named Sparta. And Sparta is a fascinating, if we have time I can tell you about it. It was a fascinating city-state, very interesting. But the Spartans were renowned soldiers, and they were friends, and Isagoras was friends of one of their kings, because they had two kings, which is unusual for a city-state to have two kings. But
that way one of them could go on a vacation and they wouldn't get tired.
Well, it was actually, I'll tell you about that if we have time, of why they ended up with that. But anyway, one of the kings was named Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes, king of Sparta, was friends with this Isagoras aristocrat fellow. And so Isagoras comes to Cleisthenes and says, old friend, I'm losing power in Athens, and this Cleisthenes fellow is coming up with this crazy democracy idea that basically means, us aristocrats won't run things. And he said, would you basically, you help me get back in power at Athens. So all of a sudden, the Athenians, they have their council of 500, they have their assembly, and in comes Cleomenes and these foreigners, these Spartan foreigners, to come and impose the aristocracy on the state. Well, what happened was Cleisthenes left, because, what can he do about these Spartan soldiers? But the people of Athens, they heard that Isagoras was trying to dissolve their council. And back in those days, most middle-class Athenian citizens had weapons. They were called hoplites because they had the hoplon shield, and they, it would have a shield and a spear, and they knew about forming a phalanx, which is a line of soldiers, and so they knew about those things. And so the people heard that these Spartans had come and were trying to shut down their democracy, so they all, without us knowing, any particular individual who organized it, it's almost like they organized it themselves. They all started coming out and just together besieged the Spartans in the Acropolis of Athens, which is, you can see that today. It's up on a hill. It's where the temple is. And but all the citizens kind of simultaneously got this idea that they were going to save their democracy. And so they besieged the Spartans. And Cleomenes, couldn't do anything about it, because there were too many Athenians. So he had to surrender. And, kind of left Athens with his tail between his legs, really embarrassed. And Cleomenes is one of these guys in history who's really mad and power-grabbing all the time. Can you think of anyone else who, like in the Bible, I'm trying to think, who else would be someone like him who's angry all the time? And
Herod seemed kind of angry. Herod and...
Sure.
And then there were the kings of the Old Testament, such as Ahab.
Right. Yeah, he would have been one of those types. He was really cruel and ruthless, and he was, deeply, ready to take offense, and, was a real vengeful fellow. So you kind of imagine this guy who's, who, instead of Ahab, though, going home and pouting on his bed when he couldn't have something, Cleomenes would go home and rage up and down his room, because, he can't have his way, and he was humiliated by these, Athenian commoners. And so he got really, really mad. Managed to save Isagoras, though, and bring him back to Sparta, I think. But so anyway, the Athenians had kicked him out and saved their democracy. And then they invited Cleisthenes back to come, finish his reforms. And so that's how it got started. But Cleomenes wasn't done, because he was really angry about losing to Athens. So he said, fine, I am going to call all of Sparta's allies and tell Athens' neighbors that, now is the time to get revenge on Athens for all the, neighborly feuds that they had. And so they ended up, all of a sudden, the Athenian democracy is faced with a three-way threat. Sparta and its extensive league, it was the Peloponnesian Alliance that Sparta led. Sparta and all their allies coming up from the south towards Athens, and then Athens' neighbor Thebes, and a city from the island of Euboea coming in from the east, and Thebes from the west, and they were coming from three directions to converge on Athens. And all these city-states in Greece, that was more than the Athenians could handle by themselves. So it looked like they were going to be, Athens was going to get wiped off the map, basically, because here you have three armies from three different directions, and they're all, this is a lot more soldiers than Athens has. And so, but when the Athenians decided, well, we'll take it one at a time, we'll fight with the Spartans and their allies first, and then we'll turn and fight with our neighbors. So the Athenians got their little army out there in front of Athens, and the Peloponnesian and Spartans came up, and then, when it looked like they were going to invade, they stopped. And the two kings of Sparta started quarreling with each other, because remember, they had two kings, and both were out there on the battlefield. And pretty soon, as things go on, the Athenians are standing there, waiting for this enormous battle, and nothing happens. Instead, these people quarrel, and then everyone starts to leave and go home. And so they think that's great, and then the Athenians turn around and they fight their two neighbors, and beat Thebes and beat the other ones and take actually new territory for themselves. And so it looked like Athens was going to get completely wiped off the map by this overwhelming force, but all of a sudden it turned tables and the Athenians were on the rise. And so the question is, well, why did Cleomenes leave? Why did the Spartans leave? Why didn't they, they invited all their allies to come on this campaign against Athens. Why would everyone leave? And the answer was because Cleomenes made a bad mistake. Mm-hmm. He was carried away with his revenge, and he said, you know what, folks? I'm going to go up to Athens. We're all going to go up to Athens, all you Spartans and Sparta's allies, and we are going to make Isagoras a tyrant, the tyrant of Athens. Now, there's a difference between the aristocracy and a tyrant, because a tyrant rules by himself. The aristocrats, there's several of them, right? And they all kind of share power. So none of Sparta's allies or the rest of the Spartans themselves liked tyrants. Tyrants were a bad thing for Greece. Even though it was maybe they had oligarchs or something like that, tyrants were bad. And so when Cleomenes was mad enough to say that he was going to install a tyrant in Athens, all of a sudden his massive army wouldn't support him anymore. And they all just said, nope, that's too much. We don't want to do that.
Well, we're going to take a break and do part 2 in a minute.